Good evening and welcome to Gwinnett County Public Library's Meet the Author series. Tonight's author is Andreas Karelas with his book, Climate Courage: How Tackling Climate Change Can Build Community, Transform the Economy, and Bridge the Political Divide in America. We have a very special moderator with us tonight. His name is Jay Bassett. Mr. Bassett served as the EPA's Sustainable Material Management Program's Senior Advisor. He served on the EPA's National Leadership Council for development and deployment of its community-driven framework, including coordinating interagency collaboration and supporting the White House Task Force under Executive Order 14008 on climate change. He is retired recently, but he continues to support Drawdown Georgia and a number of other organizations who work on equitable and sustainable development strategies and tools. Jay, take it from here, sir. And thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Denise. And again, I want to just pass along my thanks to Gwinnett County Public Libraries and, of course, the Keep Georgia or Keep Gwinnett Clean and Beautiful, who I'm a board member of, who was kind enough to connect me with Denise to do this. So looking forward to an hour with Andreas Karelas, who is the author of Climate Courage. It was a book I had to read. And honestly, Andreas, it was one that warmed my heart a lot, because I can tell you, over my, quote, 35 years of public service, there are many things that you talked about in here that are very pragmatic for not just, the people we're going to talk to here, our citizens and constituents, but also for policymakers, also in terms of how we look at climate change and pragmatic solutions in places that we have agreement to. So maybe I thought we could start with a little bit of always a little bit of your self-introduction, but maybe I'll start it off with a question on the inspiration you had for writing the book and kind of what drove the vision that drove you in the research and kind of piecing together some of the, the philosophical pieces that laid out the strategies that you talked about in the book.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jay. And thanks to Denise and to the Gwinnett Public Library for having us here tonight to discuss this important topic. I'm honored to get to talk about the book and this subject with you. Yeah, I mean, in terms of writing the book, the inspiration behind it was really, I think, probably the inspiration for a lot of you joining tonight. We know that there's this massive problem called climate change, and we know that unless we do something about it, it's going to have, really severe and terrible consequences for the planet, many of which we're already seeing, impacting our neighbors and impacting people around the world. And so I think for me, the concept of climate courage, what climate courage is really about is, where do we find the courage to act? How do we find that sense of bravery that's really required to face this threat head on and take action? And because it is scary, and I think we have to admit that it's really scary. It's this huge problem. It's a bit out of our hands as individuals, it feels like. And so there's often a question of how do you do something about it? And really, the inspiration behind writing the book and really the question that I was trying to answer while writing it was really, it's my own question, which is, what can I do? What can we do? How do we really get involved? And so, what I found in my many years working in the space and trying to answer this question is that I get the most hope. I get the most feelings of confidence and optimism that we can solve this when I see examples of people in their communities taking action and making something happen that maybe 1 million people told them that's not possible. You'll never be able to do that. The economics don't work. It's too expensive. There's too much red tape. You can't do that. But you see, and importantly, what was most inspiring for me was seeing people on both sides of the aisle, people seeing people of all different political stripes that took action at the community level, and they were successful. And that's really, I've strung together a series of narratives in the book that to me are the bright spots in the climate fight, because we can look at the news and we can look at the reality of climate change impacting our world today, and we can get very scared and overwhelmed very quickly. But if we stop there, then we're in real trouble, right? So we have to say, what are the stories, what are the narratives that are going to get us off the couch and get us into action? And that's what I tried to put here in the book.
Good. Yeah, I noticed in one of those narratives, and I call it, the way you talked about is reframing the narrative, right? And I really like the concept you put down around the elephant and the rider, right? Sometimes we like to think we're really in control, but maybe with our thinking brain, but maybe we're not really. I really found that compelling for me anyway, of, that sometimes we have to find ways to, be the rider, right? And part of that is reframing it in a way that we can put our arms around and grasp into it. So I'd be, from your view, as with that kind of concept, what do you see as, for both individuals and then us as communities to be able to reframe that narrative in a positive way based upon the stories that you've seen and you told in the book? So I'd be interested in your feedback on that.
Yeah. So, and I love, I'm glad that analogy resonated with you, Jay. I found out about it reading a book called Switch, which was written by Chip and Dan Heath. And they actually took that analogy from a psychologist, Jonathan Haidt. And this idea of, the rider and the elephant is basically saying that, and I think an easy way to put it is, there are different parts of our brain that are sort of in control at different times. And you can think of the elephant as sort of our more instinctive, sort of emotional, reactive part of our brain. And this is a more ancient part of our brain evolutionarily. And so this is, and then there's the rider on top, which is our more sort of recently evolved part of our brain. And it's much more logical and rational, and it can think in time, and it can make plans. And it's what we use to, build a house or, do our taxes. Whereas the elephant is really what's, coming to life when we are, running from a tiger or, something like that. Right. And so what's interesting, so, an example that you might think about is, let's say, like many of us, you're trying to eat healthier, right? The rider, your rational brain, is the one that's saying, well, we're going to, get on a diet and eat, fruits and vegetables. And then you're walking down the street and there's a, donut shop and there's a donut in the window and the elephant says, forget the diet, it's donut time, you jump in and have a bite. And so that, and we all know that experience in some flavor, some variety. And so the reason why they call it the rider and the elephant is because the rider thinks that they're in charge. But the elephant is actually a much bigger animal, than the rider, and it can really kind of go where it wants to. And so the distinction that we have to realize is that the elephant is very emotional and the rider is very rational. And in order for us to communicate a message about climate change, we have to learn how to speak to our emotional selves as opposed to just the rational mind. And that's what, if you look at most climate change messaging over the last few decades, it really is very rational. It's talking about by 2050, we're going to have this much sea level rise if we don't reduce this much CO2 by this amount, by this date. And it's all very logical and rational. And that's what the science has shown us. And that's very true. But we have to, and for some people, and I imagine many of the people on this call who already understand the problem and already know that we have to do something, when they hear the urgency of the data, this is what the latest IPCC report has told us, et cetera, that's going to motivate us to action. But Jay, this is the most important thing, is it's about understanding who your audience is. And if your audience isn't there yet, let's say they're hearing about this for the first time, or even worse, let's say they've been hearing sort of, people who they trust for many years disclaiming climate science, saying that this isn't true, this isn't happening, this is a hoax, or whatever, then you have to understand that emotionally, that's where they are. They're saying, wait a minute, I'm skeptical of this global warming business. What are you talking, who are you? And, who are you, who do you represent, and all this kind of stuff. So emotionally, if we're speaking to a group of people that aren't already involved and engaged, then you have to learn first how to connect emotionally. And that means speaking to them about what they already care about, right? You have to, and so really that boils down to, ironically, it's about listening, right? It's about asking the questions. What is it that the people who I'm trying to communicate with care about? And asking and listening and finding out, because, and this is, Catherine Hayhoe, who wrote the foreword for the book, she's one of the world's top climate scientists. Her main point is that we need to connect the dots between what people already care about and climate change. So, for example, if somebody says, I care about fishing, I'm an angler, or I'm a hunter, or I'm an outdoorsman, I go hiking with my grandkids, right? Those are touch points that you can connect the dots to climate change and say, did you know that, the fish that you typically fish are impacted by the water temperatures rising, right, because of climate change, and find out where people really care, what they care about in their life, and connect that to the climate crisis.
No, you're exactly right. I think I think we talked earlier, meet people where they're at, right? That's kind of what we were talking about. You got to meet them where they are to be able to have the conversation. One of the other quotes you used that really resonated with me was, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And so the way I kind of translated that is, sometimes, we get so, the immensity of the problem that maybe we can't see that maybe it's just individual actions and small steps. And you just got to start the journey. Maybe you spend too much time figuring out how you're going to get there. Maybe the most important thing is just to start the journey. So yes. I'd be interested in some of your perspectives on, how do the people are listening tonight say, if I want to start my journey, how do you start and take that single step? That at least based upon the research you did and the writing and the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is really, really important question. And I think that's right. I think, again, going back to that rider and elephant analogy, if you look out at the problem and you say, oh, well, we have to transform the entire energy, landscape of the entire world. And, that's really scary. And so if you look at that huge problem, which it is, and we do have to look at that, but if that's all you look at, then your elephant, the emotional part of your brain, is going to go, there's nothing, there's no path forward here. I'm not moving. And so you have to give the elephant, here are some simple steps. Here's the first step that we can take. Let's take that first step. Let's take the second step, and so on. You start to get a little momentum. You get into the flow. It's just like with anything, right? Once you begin it, it becomes a whole lot easier to keep going. And so, and that's where another, problem, I think, where we as climate communicators and the climate sort of conversation has really had some challenges in terms of giving people direct ways that they can get involved and get started taking action. Historically, what we see from the environmental movement is usually one of two types of actions. The first bucket would be your personal footprint, right? Your personal environmental carbon footprint. Change your light bulbs, recycle, drive less, ride a bike, eat lower on the food chain, etc. Those are all super duper important, and we should all be doing them. And I actually write in the book about how many of them actually contribute to our own well-being, right? Which has a positive feedback loop. But ultimately, we all understand that we acting as an individual is not going to by itself create the type of change that we need at the global level. So that can feel very disempowering for people, right? I could recycle all I want, but my neighbor is going to, create a huge dump and of waste, and then that's it, we're done. The flip side, the other bucket is we often say, well, let's just, focus all our attention on Washington and get our elected officials to solve this, right? Now, for those of us that have been paying attention, the policy makers have known about this problem for at least 30 years. It's been in the public debate, and yet they haven't really taken much action. So, and now I will, make a caveat to that, which is that right now, the Biden administration, and the infrastructure package that's moving through Congress is actually, could be the most significant climate legislation we've ever seen. But the point being that we as individuals often don't really feel that we have that much say in Washington, that we don't have, that there's only a limited amount of impact we can really have. We sign a petition, we go to a march, we email or call our congressperson, but there's also, again, that sense of disempowerment or that sense of lack of agency, But to me, where the listeners on the call and where all of us can get involved is in between those two, in between the individual level and the sort of very top level. And that's at the community level, because at the community level, we can work with our neighbors, which, by the way, makes it a whole lot more enjoyable to kind of take action. And it makes you feel like we're able to get more done by working together. And also, when you work at the community level, you can build projects and have an impact that's big enough to matter. It's big enough to matter to you and your community members. And once you see that happening, and that could be anything, it could be putting up solar panels on the local school or church or homeless shelter. And that's some of the work that, I do with my organization, Revolve. It could be, creating bike lanes. It could be creating community gardens. It could be energy efficiency programs that are instituted at the community level. There could be putting in a EV charging station at the grocery store. There's a lot of ways that people can work together to create action at the community level. And when you do that, that starts to build new narratives and new momentum.
Yep. Matter of fact, I'd like to say, at least here in Gwinnett, we're starting to see some of that as well. I mean, County Parks and Recs has been, I think, over the last year, they've put in 7 or 8 new community gardens as a community asset, right? That has a social connection as well as, local food and local food systems and that type of thing. And,
fantastic.
In their conversations, they talk about, wouldn't you rather, if you spend $1 here, wouldn't you rather the dollar stay here supporting the local farmer, right?
That's right. That's right.
I think that's kind of what you're talking about, is as we build this system of, how do we make it so we're all valuing and driving wealth out of this, but at the same time, it's connecting us better as a community, as well as we're getting good environmental outcomes that address these broader global problems. That's kind of what I'm doing.
Absolutely. And just a quick, tag on to that would be, one of the interesting data points I found researching the book was that during World War II, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the victory gardens that were happening across the country, that basically citizens were encouraged to grow vegetables for themselves in the community and also for the war effort. And during that time, I mean, this blew my mind. 40% of the country's vegetables were grown in people's backyards during with these victory gardens, right? So that's the power of people taking action at the local level when we work together.
Right. And there's even another group called the Food Well Alliance, which is linking local urban ag producers and farmers together in a local food system. So that's building this economic model that I know, as you look at that clean energy transformation, which goes with materials too, right? What we can do.
Yes.
Make a business case. So let me shift a little bit, maybe a little bit from the book. And I know you talk about it in the book, but a little bit more into Revolve. And So maybe you could tell the listeners a little bit more about what Revolve is doing and its role in terms of both community, but maybe also, this linkage. And I know you mentioned this in the book around unlikely allies, right? And how maybe this nonprofit, community-based nonprofit helps maybe make some of those linkages. So let me let you open the door to talk a little bit about that, because I know you got to have some passion on that.
Thanks, Jay. I appreciate it. Yeah, and really, the question that brought me to write the book is really the same question that brought me to start Revolve 10 years ago, which is a nonprofit organization. And what we do is we help create financing opportunities to help local nonprofits go solar. So, there are a lot of challenges that nonprofits, when you think about the local food bank or homeless shelter or health clinic or school or church, these organizations would like to go solar because they, a lot of them want to demonstrate their commitment to solving climate change. A lot of them also want to save money on their electricity bills, which they can then put back into their mission. And they have significant challenges to doing that. And I'll spare you the details, but basically the nonprofits in this country have a really hard time going solar. So Revolve, we're a nonprofit, and our mission is to help other nonprofits go solar. And we do that by training volunteers who we call solar ambassadors. And these are, anybody across the country. Again, this gets back to the question of empowerment. Anybody in the country who's concerned about climate change, or who cares about clean energy, or even who just cares about a local nonprofit in their community. Maybe it's their kid's school, or maybe it's their house of worship. And if they want to help a nonprofit go solar, we train them through an online training platform called our Solar Ambassador Bootcamp. And anyone can be a solar ambassador. And basically, we teach you how to go into your community and talk to local nonprofits and present them the opportunity of going solar. And then, of course, what we do is we provide zero down financing. So a nonprofit, let's call it, a local school, could go solar for free. They start saving 15 to 20% on their electricity bills right away. And then we continue to save them more and more money over time, while we're also reducing all this pollution from going into the environment. And it's important, Jay, what one of our main focuses is that solar energy needs to be represented in communities, particularly those that were worst hit by the old energy economy. We know that communities of color, low-income communities have bore the brunt of the fossil fuel economy. It's where power plants are built. It's where toxic waste is stored. It's where asthma and cancer rates are highest, and all of these things. And so we need to make sure that the clean energy economy is reaching everybody, that there's solar access, which right now there is a problem around equity and access, and where is solar being deployed. So it's important, that Revolve is what we call our financing model, the Solar Seed Fund, and it's a revolving fund that proceeds from each project help the next project go solar, and we think of it as planting a seed in each community. So we want to make sure that we're planting a seed for solar, particularly in those communities that are most left out.
Yeah, one thing I'd just like to maybe enter into a little bit of a dialogue with you about, on that conversation of, underserved and underrepresented communities, is that when I was doing work with an EPA for what they now call their Community Works program, was the recognition that, even here in Gwinnett, we have lots of, underrepresented, underserved communities. So it's not about this one, them just over there. It's also within the communities we all live within, making sure that we're bringing that voice to the table.
Yes.
So I just, again, it's like food deserts, right? Who wants to live in a food desert? We all knew we have people in our neighborhood that are food insecure. So we ought to, keep in mind that these solutions you're talking about are applicable in Gwinnett, in Norcross, every community there is, because we have communities that have been impacted that could benefit from, these efforts and these plans, and being integrated more in our economy as well.
That's right. I couldn't agree more. And Jay, the thing that was one of the most interesting things to me about the research I did putting the book together. There's a professor out of Stanford. His name is Mark Jacobson, and him and his team have looked at the entire country and mapped out what it would look like to get to 100% clean energy. And what they found is that when the United States gets to 100% clean energy, which, by the way, President Biden has called for reaching 100% clean electricity by 2035, that when we get to 100%, we will, as citizens, we will collectively save $1 trillion. That's a trillion with a T. Right. $1 trillion on our electricity bills every single year. And by the way, we're going to create a net increase of 2 million new jobs, building this out. So when you look at that, then it reinforces this equity question even more, because we need to make sure that everybody can benefit from those new jobs and that electricity bill savings, not to mention the reduced air pollution and cleaner air.
Right. So I have a question in the chat that's a little bit different, but I'm going to pose it. It may be more mine than yours, but I want your opinion on that. And it's about, of course, the ever-present recycling question. Okay. And the question was, why can't we have nationwide recycling rules in one city that they recycle bottles in my town? No bottles. It's so hard to do something about our personal footprint. So basically what they're saying, why do we not have policies around standardization of recycling definitions, rules on what we do or don't do? And so I don't know if you have some thoughts on that. I can certainly share some.
I'll let you go first, and I actually have some thoughts on that, how it ties to energy. But go ahead, Jay. Why don't you take a crack at that?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of pieces on that. One is there is an energy conversation and there's an economic conversation. So I think in the history and even how we look at how we manage, we wheel our cart out to the curb. We expect for it to kind of go away. And we have spent a lot of money and effort and policy putting in place, what we call health and sanitation, right? We want to make sure we're not harming folks per se. So the idea is that we've asked local governments to get really good at how fast they can move stuff away and put it in a hole in the ground, quite frankly, and keep it away from folks. And what we've never really talked about, though, is that everything we've done is about public health and sanitation. It never has been written in or understands that these collection programs are also part of a supply chain, right? And there's an economic case to be made for the supply chain. And we still don't have both either at the local level, state level, and those things have to be kind of tried at the local and state before they come nationally on how we do that. And then the second piece is, since we're a market-based economy, generally speaking, you let the market rule. So that way, the general thing is, well, national government specifically stays out of the market places, market solutions, which recycling is. So I think there's a number of disconnects. The last thing I would tell you, and I know this could be a little bit, wonky, I guess, is that, local governments and recycling programs have a little bit of a tie to civil rights legislation. And so, and there was actually the initial thing which said local governments are responsible for solid waste, which really kept the national government out from doing things like recycling rules, for example. And when they put that legislation or that rule in place back in '65, it now meant that recycling industry and the economics depends upon the goodwill of 18,000 municipalities on how they want to participate in the supply chain. That's why it's so darn difficult and why it changes from one city to another. But I'd like to be hopeful that there is some movement on the policy side on recycling legislation. I think it's going to be different. It won't be recycling rules. It'll be things like extended producer responsibility frameworks, which then say that the manufacturers that produce those goods have some ownership of their end of life or their disposal, And if we want to recycle them, that they help fund the systems to help pull those back into the economy. And I do think those kind of things, based on a market-based approach, are ones that I anticipate we'll see a lot more of. And I think the other thing, which I know people will ask about and want to know about, is things like bottle bills, right? The idea of putting a deposit on a bill, on a bottle, that you can get that deposit back as an incentive. I think those are the kind of local legislative fixes that will eventually see maybe mixed in a little bit with some of this national conversation on producer responsibility. The last thing I would tell you on this, and this kind of goes back to your book, Andreas, is that, you talk in your book about unlikely alliances, and that there's a lot more work, a lot more positive and efforts that are underway and investments being made for clean energy and climate change than maybe folks typically see that are being investments made. I mean, even in the state of Georgia, even on a policy side around carbon sequestration, that we're seeing, significant policy moves to monetize carbon in the economy, right? In a conservative state, that's a big move. Well, the same thing with recycling programs are, the big, Walmarts, Targets, Coca-Colas are finally putting real money on the table in a real way to fund local infrastructure to collect recycling. And we're going to see more of that. So back to the caller on that is, I know they really want to talk about maybe glass bottles, which is a little bit more difficult, but I do think there are some solutions coming on how we can make sure we have a place to recycle glass bottles. It may not be at the curb, but there are ways we can do this economically, and there are industries that are willing to help fund that infrastructure. So,
thanks, Jay. I appreciate that. And yeah, it's a challenge. And actually, I mean, there's a close analogy here to an energy question, and that is around renewable energy policies, which very similar to the recycling are, they change in every state and city and county in terms of the permitting, in terms of what's allowed, in terms of the regulations, what's required by utilities, what the process is. And in fact, we see that in Europe and Australia, for example, the cost of installing solar panels is almost half what it is in the United States, because in the United States, there's so much red tape with the permitting and the interconnection process and all of these things, where they've really streamlined it at a national level in other countries, right? And we have not yet done that in the United States. And this is, and you also mentioned, sort of the idea of like cities and states piloting things, which then, go up to the federal level. And on the energy side, there is a policy in the states that we've seen for many, many years now called a Renewable Portfolio Standard, or an RPS. And we have, 30 states plus the District of Columbia that have renewable portfolio standards in place, and they've been very successful. And basically what it is it's a rule that the state puts into place that requires the utility to meet a certain amount of their energy usage with renewables by a certain date. And what we're now seeing in this Biden infrastructure package, which is very exciting, is a national clean electricity standard, or clean energy standard, CES. And this is basically saying, look, 30 plus states have done this for many, many years. Let's make it national so that it's very clear. It's the same rule everywhere, and we could all make it a lot easier, especially for businesses that are working across states, right? That have to navigate, well, if I'm installing solar in Georgia, I have to do X, Y, Z. But if I'm in Alabama, it's this, right? That's that's where the federal government can really make it much easier with a policy like a clean energy standard.
Yeah, and and we talked about this, Andreas. I actually was part of writing some of the regulations for the renewable fuels portfolio. And the interesting thing with that is, really the US EPA is a pretty small agency, and yet it is the arbitrator between the two largest segments of our economy, which is the petroleum industry and the ag industry, which is really the transference of those credits, right? Is really, if you get down to it, it's agricultural production of fuels, right? Yes. And so, as we look and talk about these things, when you're really dealing with those big segments of the economy, then, doing these small things become very difficult because everyone's thinking, well, this is going to cause, farmers are going to want to now go sweeten their stock to be able to get a specific fuel credit if we let this little thing, which looks like the right thing to do it. So that's some of the complexities of these policies. And, they're trying to make them market-based, but, at the same time, put a little bit of teeth into them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
So there was another question out there, and which I didn't know about. Andreas, it says, your next book, tell us more about it. So what are you up to?
I don't have another book yet in the works, although I appreciate the encouragement. Perhaps this book is just came out less than a year ago, so I'm still going to be recuperating from the writing process of this one for a little bit longer. But actually, I do write a bi-weekly op-ed for The Hill. So if you guys are familiar with The Hill, it's a policy sort of magazine, online press outlet. You can look up, my last name at The Hill, and you'll find, all my articles there. And so I have one come out every other week. And I try to write about what I see happening in the clean energy and climate space, and what I think are important things for people to be looking at.
Yeah. One of the things, and we had talked about this a little bit too, coming in at, in regards to that is, I know, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and others and Department of Energy that are really looking at to put in, through some of the infrastructure money, jobs money, the American Rescue Plan of really trying to figure out how do they deliver resources, money for clean energy solutions at the community level, right? And how do they do that? And, it's a big question, right? Because it means developing new ways to do, grants and investments, new ways to do technical assistance to help communities build community solar, do other things, community organizations do that. So I didn't know if in any of your writings in that, and as you looked at the book, if you might have some thoughts on that, in terms of, this idea of this community-facing organizations that can help build this infrastructure of the future and what that role might look like.
Yeah, well, I'll say this, Jay. Again, I think, what we see is that at the community level, people know what they need. People know what is the reality in their current, situation, and what's the best way to get us to a just clean energy future. So, for example, in the book, I talk about, Dale Ross, who was a Republican, conservative mayor of the city of Georgetown, Texas. And, when he was faced with the choice of signing up for power for the city of Georgetown for the next 20 years, he was not looking at it from a climate perspective, but just looking at dollars and cents. He realized it made most sense for the Georgetown, Texas taxpayers to go with 100% renewable energy. And so he ended up, deciding that route. And now Georgetown is the second city in America to be 100% renewable energy powered already today. So to me, Jay, it's really about, looking at now in Texas, and, there's a particularly abundant amount of wind and solar, and as there is in Georgia, there's plenty of sunshine in Georgia, right? And so you really do have to look at the community level, what's working, what's already happening. The Sierra Club has a program called the Ready for 100 campaign, and you've seen volunteers around the country who have convinced their local city and county officials to commit to 100% renewable energy, by a certain date, and they're then tasked with figuring out, well, how do you do that? What are the resources that we need in order to get there? So that's really where I think people need to look to. And one thing I'll say on that too, Jay, when it comes back to this broader conversation, right? Like I said, the Biden administration in their infrastructure bill, has put forth this vision that we can get to 100% clean electricity by 2035, 80% by 2030. Here's And then of course you're going to have to look at the community level to see how we should do that. But I think there's a bigger sort of aha that I think we need to address, which is that most of us, probably many of us on this call, think that this is a controversial topic, right? Many of us think that, wait a minute, who's this guy talking about 100% renewable energy right now? That's, pie in the sky. Americans will never go for that. That's not true. Study that came out of, the Yale Center on Climate Change Communication found that 85% of Americans agree that they would like to see America be 100% renewable energy powered. Let me say that again. 85% of Americans are in favor of 100% renewable energy. So stop and ask yourself a question. How many things do 85% of Americans agree on today, right? Like, we're in a pretty divided moment. And to me, that's actually what's most exciting. It's probably the biggest takeaway from the book, is that we have such a sense of agreement. We're so on the same page around renewable energy, more so than almost any other issue, that actually it can be something that brings our country together. It can be something that helps to heal the wounds that we've felt, so strongly over the last few years. So that, and like I said, and guess what? In the process, we're also going to create 2 million new jobs. We're going to save ourselves $1 trillion a year on electricity, and we're going to reduce air pollution and deaths from dirty air, and we're going to create a climate-safe future for the next generation.
Yeah, and just as a follow-up to that, one of the other organizations I belong to is the Citizens Carbon Lobby, right, around the carbon tax and dividend plan, which is really part of that, Bob Englis and the conservative side that really drove this conversation, and then into the bipartisan caucus. And so, I didn't, number one, I don't know if you have thoughts on that specific legislation. I can certainly say I think it's really important. Yes, but it's really important because it represents really, the young conservatives, which we know say we need to do something. Mm-hmm. It represents this, kind of, as you say, this agreement across the aisle on clean energy as a way to move forward on a policy perspective and advance it. And then, I do think that, there's the shared interest opportunities here to actually advance. The thing I would tell you, you mentioned the Yale School of Climate Communication. I did, we talked about this. I did pull up, and you can dial down to Gwinnett and actually get their survey in Gwinnett. And, over 55 to 65% of the population, your data is even consistent here in Gwinnett on, these solutions. I think what seems to be always the showstopper from my view on that is that, when they get down to saying, well, is this impacting me? Then most people say no. And then the other folks is, well, I don't know what to do about it. Right. That's right. Well, here we are. We've got, corporations, but we've got both sides that are actually talking together, to do that. So we just, we all kind of need to do our part and roger up and say yes. And, and say, we support you on that, because I think there is consensus.
That's right. And I'll say, an important point here. Again, this is from Katharine Hayhoe, and I write about this in the book. She says the most important thing we can do about climate change is talk about it. And you might think that's kind of how does that really apply? Well, apparently 2/3 of Americans say that they never talk about climate change. They don't hear about it. They don't chat with their family or friends or, their coworkers about this issue. And partly that's because we're sort of afraid, that if we bring it up, maybe we'll offend somebody, or we don't know what their stance is. So I don't want to, make this conversation awkward. So I'm not going to bring it up. But lo and behold, if we were to talk about it more often, we'd find how much commonality there is, that we actually all do agree. Like you said, especially young conservatives are saying there's no disagreement here. We want to preserve the planet. Let's get to the table to talk about what's the best policy to do that. And I think there are a lot of great policies that could do that. So it's really, ultimately, if you want to do one thing, partly it's just, maybe tell a friend that you heard about this talk and maybe send them a link. Bring it up with your neighbors, bring it up with, your friends and folks you work with. Get the conversation started, because if we start talking about it, we'll see how much consensus there really is.
Yeah, I agree. So a few more questions here, and then we'll probably get ready to start wrapping up. One was, I do want to mention, that I am on the board of Gwinnett Clean and Beautiful, and just, they were kind enough to connect me. And I just do want to remind folks here that here in Gwinnett, Clean and Beautiful is doing a lot of work supporting community-led efforts that include broader sustainability efforts, and certainly are a supporter of the conversations we've been having tonight. The second one was, which I'm going to leave on your lap, and then maybe interplay on that, is what's your take on nuclear, right? And I'll leave you with a story on that, because believe it or not, I was one of my EPA roles was to do the decommissioning plan for the Oak Ridge facility and Savannah River plant.
Wow.
And so I can tell you about legacy nuclear waste issues. But anyway, without diving into that, let me turn this question over to you from an energy perspective and your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, Jay, I mean, honestly, there's probably not a more hotly debated topic. And I guess I would just say, look, I mean, there are a lot of nuclear power plants that are still online and producing a lot of power without carbon right now. And that's important, right? That's great. That is really helping us, and we don't want to necessarily turn those off prematurely or replace them with natural gas, which could be the case, because that would be adding to the overall carbon footprint. But what I would say, I mean, I generally fall into the category with Mark Jacobson from Stanford and others, which is that we can create a 100% renewable energy powered economy without nuclear, and that 100% renewable energy is actually cheaper to achieve, and it's faster to get to than building new nuclear facilities would be. So ultimately, it's really a question of where's the best sort of bang for your buck, and there's certainly new nuclear technologies that are being explored and invested in, and some of those are very promising. But at the end of the day, and again, this is sort of the data that I point to in the book, is that it really boils down to investors and Wall Street, right? And ultimately, it's sort of like Wall Street has sort of lost its appetite in investing in nuclear energy because of the amount of time it takes, the amount of delays, and ultimately the cost, where you could spend a fraction of that cost and a fraction of that time and get the same amount of power, through renewable energies. And that's only going to get cheaper and cheaper.
Yeah. And there was another follow-up question in the Q&A, which I picked up on. Nuclear power would be cheaper if spent nuclear fuel was reprocessed. Well, I can tell you it's been attempted many times, and I was involved in the cleanup of the messes that was caused by fuel reprocessing. It is a very difficult thing. As a matter of fact, from our national defense waste right for plutonium production, where we actually dissolve fuel rods to pull out the fuels, and then that's that highly radioactive waste that we're still trying to manage. And it's very difficult to do and very pricey to do. There's one other question here, is about the useful life of a solar panel and what happens to them when they reach end of life, which I think is really interesting, because Georgia Tech, for example, I was pulled into a conversation with them on windmill blades, right, which are composites. So as we talk about fossil fuels and we look at polymers, people spend a lot of time being concerned about single serve waste from packaging and what shows up in our streams. But maybe what isn't really understood is that most of the polymer use and production in this country is for infrastructure, renewable energy systems. So it is something we do need to think about in terms of how do we reuse, recapture those materials used for renewable fuel production. So
I'll just add, specifically around solar panels, it's interesting to note that, the first solar panels that were built for space use, right? It was built to power, space shuttles that could, collect energy from the sun. So they are really built to last. They're built to withstand outer space. And so, the reason I bring that up is just to say that they're very durable. You could take, you could take a pretty decent swing with a baseball bat at most solar panels, and they will be just fine. Not to say that they're unbreakable. We've certainly had our fair share of broken panels, but the point is that solar panels will continue to produce power for many, many years, likely 30 to 40 years plus. They slightly degrade. Usually it's 0.5% per year. So sometime in the 25, well, first of all, I'll say this. A solar panel is typically warranted from the manufacturer for 25 years. So now think about that for a second. How many electronics do you have that not only would last you 25 years, but's warranted for 25 years, right? Like, does your toaster come with a warranty for 25 years, right? Like not even close. So they are really built to last. And the reason why we don't know how long they will last is because the first set of panels that started going up in the 70s are all still up and running, right? There hasn't been a ton of panels that have needed to come down and be recycled. That being said, the silicon and the sort of electronic materials in solar panels are certainly valuable. They can be recycled, and I believe we have not yet gotten to that point where there's a critical enough mass that they have built out those systems. But I believe we're approaching that soon. Soon enough, we will start to develop the systems to recycle panels and use those materials again, because it's going to be very important to do so.
And Andres, I'll leave you with this. The Remade Institute, which is funded by Department of Energy, is spending $80 million to design those solutions in base research and applied research that could be commercialized. And that's underway right now. Georgia Tech is a member of that. So there's a lot of efforts going on. And then, as I mentioned, on windmill blades, they're actually reusing those windmill blades with Department of Navy as bunkers on bumpers for ships.
Wow.
So there's multiple uses.
That's amazing.
I know we're out of time. I can tell you I really enjoyed our conversation. So
likewise.
Let me turn this back over to you so you can wrap it up.
Oh, sure. Well, I'll just say thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure. Really appreciate it, Jay. And Denise, thanks so much for inviting me.
It was absolutely our pleasure. Thank you to both of you. Thank you to our friends at Gwinnett Clean and Beautiful. We're very grateful for all of the marketing help that they gave us and for introducing us to Jay. I encourage you all to go out and buy this book. It's at your local booksellers. Thank you again. Good night to Jay. Good night to Andres. And thank you everyone for coming to join us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.